Chris, first of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is a very international organization, a very great convening organization, and I look forward to discussions afterwards. After the talks, when we get together for the break after this, I would look forward to meeting with all of you. As Chris was saying, I've had the honor of getting involved with a lot of different things, but I'll talk to you about what I do today in my day job, which is at Hummer Winblad, and we invest in software companies. And we actually started back in 1989 investing. We call ourselves the Enterprise Software Fund because we stayed the course through what I would call infrastructure software or application software more for businesses. We've done less consumer-facing, I think, than most venture firms that have rushed in to look for the next big, say, social company or equivalent. When energy was in vogue and software was not, we stayed the course, and I think now people have come back as well. So we like to say that we not only are funding the early stage of software companies. Oh, sure, thank you. But we also have had the honor of being involved in companies that have started industries. We were involved with River Systems that started, when we first started, that was the leader and started the whole wave of embedded systems. OLAP, through the guise of investing in a company called Arbor, which was just 2 people when we invested, and then over time was acquired by Oracle for over $3 billion. So that was another space. And the forerunner to analytics, which today I think is one of the most interesting areas going forward. App servers, I remember when one was sketched out by 3 people on a napkin back in 1995. That, of course, now is a cornerstone to almost all of the computing that we do. Ad servers, we actually got involved with a company called Napster. So the whole idea of P2P, and actually through that, we also met every lawyer on the planet as well. And there we go. So now I can stop sort of treading time. But also, more recently, companies in the whole trend of web analytics, such as Omniture, which was the largest acquisition of 2009. We were the original seed investors there. This seemed very fitting to bring up, given this audience. Venture capital is definitely global. And you can see sort of the numbers around the world today in terms of venture dollars invested. But I think the most interesting thing to say is that in 2011, 2,000 companies received their first round of venture funding. And I find that astonishing, sort of around the world. And if you think about this also in terms of investing, it's sort of, I use the rule of thumb that roughly 1/3 of the money is invested in Silicon Valley, roughly another 1/3 is invested in the rest of the United States, and roughly another 1/3 is invested in the rest of the world. And this tends to ebb and flow, but pretty much stay within that. But in this trend of new companies getting funded, in fact, this last quarter, the second quarter of 2012, in the United States, it was the most new companies that received their first round since the first quarter of 2001. Since the bubble basically burst. And so if you think about that from the importance of creating companies, we went through that period where the bubble burst and then people stopped investing in new companies and they were just trying to protect what they had invested in, and frankly, protected a number of things way too long. But now we've sort of gone through that cycle. Venture capital's come back through the bottom. And we seem to be very engaged in looking for the next set of startups. And I think that this is actually the absolute best time to be an entrepreneur, particularly in software, and the best time to be an investor. Venture capital is very important to the economy. If we use some of these numbers, which have not been lost on the administration, which just went through a whole process to pass what's called the Jobs Act, which is to try to make it easier to go public again, try to make it easier to get funded with things such as crowdsourcing. And it was a big bipartisan bill that passed earlier this year when almost nothing gets passed in Washington. And that's because $1 of venture money has led into companies creating over $6 of revenue. And frankly, venture capital is just a minuscule part of the economy, 0.2% of 1%, but that's led, all the companies that have been funded have led to 21% of the United States GDP today. So the leverage is just incredible in venture capital. And so, we've led to about 10% of the revenue that's created today, and frankly, just as importantly, about 11% of the jobs. And in some of the most interesting jobs, I think, in society today are due to venture capital investing. And this is just to speak of, if you want to look at how investment's done in this country. In last year, about 41% of the investments were done in software and IT and media. So what are the big themes of 2012? So we tend to invest in what we call disruptions, and we tend to ride waves. So the waves that we're riding today, that I think that most people in the software industry are riding today, are in mobile, are in cloud, are in big data. And these are the buzzwords I think you hear over and over again. Mobile, no matter how we set the forecast for the creation of mobile data, we're beating them. It's now 4 years in a row where mobile data has more than doubled every single year. And it seems to be on a pace to just continue that trend. The estimates right now are that by 2020, we will be creating about 2 zettabytes of data. So that's 10 to the 21st. And so if you think about this, last year, I think we had already created about 18 million times more data that had been created in all the books ever written in the history of society. And that's doubling about every 18 months. So if you play that out, it's just mind-boggling. And that's just from mobile. In terms of cloud, the cloud is now mainstay. I mean, a couple of years ago, people wondered how is that going to play out versus what's behind the firewall versus how people are using the cloud. It's not just small companies. 76% of CIOs now are implementing cloud solutions in their corporations. It is now sort of the core. And in fact, the line of business executives are leading the CIOs in that regard. IBM just had a very interesting conference. It was Ginny Rometty, is the new IBM CEO's first conference of their customers. They brought together the CMOs and the CIOs because the CMOs now are sort of leading this notion of how to increase revenue. The CIOs and the CMOs have always kind of butted heads the last few years, particularly with this idea of wanting to have things behind the firewall and wanting to move very fast in terms of getting data and therefore implementing cloud solutions. And so bringing the two of them together was a very brilliant idea and actually working very well. And the last one we talked about, big data, is just is the trend now. When we started in 1989, the entire software industry was about 35 billion, and you see the size of the software industry today. By 1994, was the largest area for investing. The analytics world today is estimated at about 35 billion. So the same size as the software industry was in 1989, and people are seeing that it may well have the same kind of growth. The new enterprise, the PC is effectively yesterday. And it's not just here, it's everywhere. I had the honor of going to Skolkovo, which is sort of the new entrepreneurial center of Moscow that's trying to move it forward. That was with a mission about a year ago of other venture capitalists. And we had the honor of sitting there with Medvedev. Medvedev pulls out this iPad and puts on his desk, and I'm sitting there, and I have this old-fashioned PC, and I said, okay, I better put this back underneath the table, or they're going to wonder, whether we're really with the new economy or not. But smartphones and tablets outshipped PCs starting in the fourth quarter of 2010. Windows is now less than 50% of the internet-enabled devices that are out there, and we're looking at about 1.4 billion smartphone users by next year. What I find the most fascinating statistic is in 2014, we're looking at 70 billion mobile apps being downloaded. Now, if you think about this, the change in the developer world, 5 years ago, there were no Apple developers. There were no Amazon developers. There were no Facebook developers. And today, it is the trend of hundreds of thousands of each. In every wave of computing, wherever the developers go, that's where the wave goes. Microsoft saw that in the early 90s. More recently, other companies saw that. And now you even see companies like VMware, where they bought a lot of companies that are in the developer space in order to try to create a developer community. This is the trend that people are trying to capture, essentially to be leaders in these different facets of society. And Facebook is now going on 1 billion users. It's basically the third largest country, if you want to think about that. And the technologies that are being implemented, such as Siri on Apple or such as Watson and IBM, are taking us to this new wave of computing called this cognitive era of computing. The other thing about the new enterprise is it assumes that everything's being brought in, and the CIO has to cope with that. Whether that's people bringing in their own devices, and the enterprise has to deal with all different types of devices that are being brought in. People are bringing in their own devices, their own applications, they're bringing in their own data, and frankly, they're even bringing in their own infrastructure. And so the corporation, backbone is something that is just very difficult to manage and will get more and more difficult to manage. But if you're not willing to do that, you can't attract the best and brightest to come work with you. So it is definitely a dilemma that has to be dealt with by the CIO in the new enterprise. It takes very little money to build software now. We're finding that startup after startup can come in virtually bootstrapped, get to a first product because the tools are free. The data is effectively free. Computers are very inexpensive. The hard thing to find is manpower. So if people are willing to work initially because they're in love with the company, love with the startup, you can start with very little dollars. The irony is that it probably takes more money to fund a successful company now because there's so much competition that the marketing and sales dollars that follow once you have a successful product is actually even higher than it's ever been before. And this is the first time that we're seeing huge changes in what I would call the database. This is the first time that I can remember in about 30 years that SQL is being challenged by all different types of new databases that are looking at this from an unstructured point of view. Particularly Hadoop is sort of leading in that idea of NoSQL. Almost all of our companies are using open source, and we're investing in many open source companies. And they're using that as a starting point, and then they're building products around it they call open core, and effectively that gives you a very fast start, high velocity sales model. But also, again, it leads to, that's why Android, for example, is now able to outpace the iPhone in terms of being free and open source operating systems to be able to build on many different variants. We talked about the big data era, but it's not just the amount of data, it's the type of data. It's very dynamic. It's coming in, the stream is coming in extremely quickly, and people are trying to mine that stream. It's very, very complex. It's very, very dynamic. And it's going beyond the things you would normally think of. So it's going beyond the, your iPhones, your iPads, your other tablets, your other PCs, your computers. The data is now coming in from what some people refer to as machine to machine, some people refer to as the Internet of Things. The Federal Communications Commission just last month, for the very first time, created what's called radio spectrum is the basis of what's used in order to do mobile computing. They created, and normally that's either commercial or it's used by government users, but last month they created, for the very first time, a sort of vendor-independent band called the Medical Body Area Network. So that can lead to applications where, patients are embedded with sensors instead of having all these wires hanging off of them. So they can be monitored. They can detect heart attacks before they happen. They can look at, insulin levels and use body pumps basically from afar to inject patients. The ramifications of what we can do in this Internet of Things, whether it's healthcare, whether it's energy, such as the smart grid and all your appliances talking to each other at home and talking to you. This is where this is all headed. 50 billion devices by 2020. And people believe that the amount of data that will be created from this will be as much, if not more, than the data that's created in the standard cellular ways that we understand today. This will be the sort of transformation of our life. We look at, if you break down computing today, it's sort of in two flavors. One is the remaking of the data center. Clearly, there's a number of things that we already talked about. The other is the fact that people are trying to find ways to increase their revenue, and online you have this closed loop that allows you to look at the analytics and make decisions almost in real time. And so analytics now has become a huge area of consideration. IBM, for example, in the last 18 months, 14 large analytics companies, and doesn't seem to be slowing down. The stack that's being built up of analytics is just huge. And there's essentially a number of drivers of that. One is, of course, that it's real time. Another one is that it's adaptive, and that people can look at that data and make things tailored just to you. It's across all verticals, whether that's in looking at analytics not just for the web, but for TV, looking at it for the supply chain, looking at it for commodities, looking at it for brick and mortar now in terms of bringing that data, GPS data that you can get and try to figure out that whole flow. And then the other part of analytics is trying to bring in all the social data and having that closed loop so you can figure out who's out there influencing your customers. Visualizations have now increased about 20 times over last year. People used to laugh at, they'd look at USA Today and they say, okay, that's really a cartoon, it's not a real newspaper. And now everybody wants to put those visualizations in everything they're doing because it allows people to better understand how to read their systems. The whole notion of real-time dashboards that bring together the head of corporations on through in real time their entire companies, looking at their key indicators. And of course, this whole idea of working with unstructured data to be able to figure out how to make some sense out of sentiment or how to make some sense out of decision making. But we look at it as it allows you to engage, it allows you to create your brand, and it allows you to optimize. Chris, how are we doing?
We have another 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So the other big part of bringing all this forward, of course, if you have to live in this world, is security. Security and integration, I would say, are the two open areas that people are working on today to try to make this enterprise work. Security is an area, everybody thinks security is always done. They see large security companies, but it's never done. There's a whole new set of things to secure. There's a whole new set of companies that are cropping up to try to figure that out. And we've invested in a number of them, and we'll keep investing in a number of them. And integration the same way, when you're trying to figure out how to bring all these disparate back-end systems together to make some sense out of it. And particularly as this back-end corporation is getting more and more complicated by the fact that it allows users to bring in whatever they want. There's just a number of logos of things that we've invested in. But in terms of, to look at this from last year's perspective, I would say we invested in 3 companies that are in analytics, predictive analytics, one around sales, one around search marketing, one around what I would call information for everyone. And this is just recently. And then on the data center side, we invested in a company that is doing IP version 6, which is the next, we're out of IPv4 addresses now. IPv6 is the one that takes this to a whole nother set to be able to accommodate all those devices that we talked about before. OpenStack, which is the idea of, that was developed at NASA and now has become, many corporations have spun out of that to create sort of the open framework for private clouds that companies are doing, and OpenFlow, which is the whole idea of moving to software-defined networks. And you saw that that's become top of mind for a number of companies. There was a big acquisition yesterday by VMware in that space. This is the area that is, what's beyond Cisco and Juniper and other companies to try to create the software backbone for all that networking. So what is scarce? So you hear about all this unemployment through this country, and this is sort of one of the big challenges for the administration. But yet, if you come here to Silicon Valley, and now, frankly, if you come here to San Francisco, which, by the way, is rivaling Silicon Valley for investment, it's a really interesting trend. In fact, the National Venture Capital Association, that typically has its annual meeting in Santa Clara, next year is having its annual meeting in San Francisco, just to show how that sort of transformation is starting to happen. You can go to a site called Indeed, and you can see, we used to have a joke. When we invested in PowerSoft back in 1991 and they took off, they were in client server development tools, the joke we had was that the heads of HR would start to put out job recs. The company was probably 2 years old and they put out job recs looking for 5 years of experience in the company. That's when you've sort of come of age. But if you type in these terms of things that are probably less than 2 years old, you see how many people are looking for people with those skills. And it's just sort of mind-boggling to realize how little talent we have trying to learn as fast as they can on the newer technologies that companies need. And if there's one thing that companies are short of, it's not money and it's not ideas, but it's talent in the Valley today. But they have a lot of stock markets, because what has happened in the last few years is that these large companies have amassed a lot of cash. And so they are able to be very acquisitive. So you're seeing a constant turnover of acquisitions, not only, frankly, of companies, but the acquisitions of people through a concept called acqui-hires, which is essentially buying out the investors and putting in great packages for very, very good startup teams, just to be able to have that talent. We had, in fact, one company that was acquired as an acqui-hire, and the company that bought them gave us the products back and said, you know, if you can make another company out of this, fine. We just want the people. So what do we look for investing? As I said, we ride waves, we invest in disruptions, we look for large market opportunities, we look for a team, not necessarily by experience, by something that's very hard to pin down, which is called excellence. But what we say is if quality people that we know will come work for them, that's a good sign of excellence. Product and technology breakthrough and economics that are going to give you a good P&L over time. These are a number of the areas that companies put together when they look to come to us to get funded. Everything from a number of the things we talked about, but also what is their secret sauce? How are they going to really succeed? So just to sum up, this is the best time to be an investor. This is the best time to be an entrepreneur. If you have an exciting startup that you want to get funded, please come in software. Please come talk to us. That's my email address. Chris, thank you very much for giving us this time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.